among the base of the Democrat Party. Support for Israel is not an applause line. It's not something that folks say proudly. And I think, Jonathan, I'll kind of a little deeper into that. I mean, it's really a product of what you see on American campuses. With the American left, Israel is seen as the Zionist oppressors. Israel, an apartheid state, that doesn't come from the right.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today we have an interesting conversation with Norm Coleman, former senator and current board chair of the Republican Jewish Coalition. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The goal of the pro-Israel community in the United States and every Israeli government has always been the same: to ensure the widest possible support for the Jewish state and to make it as bipartisan as possible. That has become an increasingly difficult task, and among those most blamed for it is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He is widely accused by the corporate press, liberal American Jews, as well as his opponents at home, of tilting towards the Republicans and alienating Democrats. Some date it to his willingness to meet with GOP presidential candidate Mitt Romney during the summer of 2012. Some say it was his defiance of President Barack Obama when he addressed a joint meeting of Congress in 2015 to oppose the dangerous Iran nuclear deal, and saying that was the turning point. Still others put it down to the Prime Minister's chumminess with former President Donald Trump during his administration. And the charges were repeated again last week when Netanyahu received Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in Jerusalem as part of a trade mission coinciding with Israel's 75th birthday celebrations that was widely regarded as having more to do with that Republican governor's presidential ambitions. Those who criticized Netanyahu pointed to the two delegations of members of Congress visiting Israel this week, one of Republicans and the other of Democrats, as proof that the old bipartisan pro-Israel spirit is still there and would be revived if only Netanyahu would stop pandering to the American right and if Republicans would also stop trying to sabotage a consensus in pursuit of partisan objectives. But the problem with this narrative is that it is completely false. If bipartisanship over Israel is becoming increasingly difficult to see, it is not because the GOP or Likud governments have junked it. To the contrary, it is the Democratic Party that is increasingly hostile to the Jewish state, and it is the Republicans who have become nearly a lockstep pro-Israel party and whose last administration under Trump did more to solidify the alliance than any in history. A little historical perspective on this is required. Some 60 years ago, the positions were reversed. The Democrats were once overwhelmingly favorable to Israel, and it was the Republicans who were divided about it. Over the course of the intervening decades, the two parties have essentially exchanged identities, with evangelicals and security hawks joining forces to make backing Israel a centerpiece of GOP foreign policy views, and on the other side, the increasingly influential intersectional left that regards the Jewish state as an expression of white privilege and regards the Palestinian war to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet as somehow morally equivalent to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. And whatever you might think about Netanyahu, he was not the one who created the breach with the U.S. a decade or more ago. Instead, it was Obama, who wanted more daylight between the two allies, was dedicated to tilting the diplomatic playing field in favor of Palestinians who were uninterested in peace with Israel, and whose foreign policy revolved around a desire for a rapprochement with and appeasement of a genocidal terrorist state in Iran. The notion that Trump's unprecedented backing for Israel, including the moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and the breakthrough of the Abraham Accords, made Israel toxic to U.S. liberals, also gets it backward. Americans who cared about Israel cheered those policies regardless of their feelings about Trump. But liberals who have bought into the apartheid state and occupation lies about Israel, fomented both by liberal critics of the Jewish state like J Street and the open anti-Zionist and anti-Semites of Jewish Voices for Peace and If Not Now, were leery of Trump because he was so comfortable with Israel. There are still plenty of Democrats in Congress who like Israel, though they are increasingly reluctant to confront their radical fellow party members. President Joe Biden boasts of his long record of support for Israel, but as the last 2+ years of his administration have shown, that backing is conditional on the Jewish state obeying his demands on Iran and other issues. Moreover, rank-and-file Democrats are also tilting away from Israel. As the most recent Gallup tracking poll on attitudes toward the Middle East showed, the trend of Democrats abandoning the Jewish state has now reached a tipping point, with, for the first time, more of them supporting the Palestinians over Israel by a 49 to 38% margin. By contrast, Republicans back Israel by a staggering 78 to 11% margin. Even worse, even as Democrats and their corporate media and Jewish press mouthpieces blame Netanyahu and the GOP for the situation, the Biden administration is now openly intervening in Israeli domestic politics, not just to try to topple Netanyahu, but echoing its own false election narratives, accusing the Likud of trying to destroy democracy for an attempt to enact judicial reform that would actually make Israel more democratic and make its system more like that used by the United States. At this point, the question is not how to restore bipartisanship, but how much damage a Democratic administration, increasingly enthralled to its leftist base, will do to the alliance. Among those most involved in this battle over the last generation is Norm Coleman, the national chairman of the board of directors of the Republican Jewish Coalition. And we're glad to have him with us today to discuss the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the way it has become yet another issue on which Democrats and Republicans disagree. Norm Coleman served in the U.S. Senate for Minnesota from 2003 to 2009 and served as mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota from 1993 to 1998. He is currently a senior counsel at a Washington law firm. Norm Coleman, welcome to Top Story.
It's great to be with you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Well, Senator, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I want to start by asking you about the blame game that is being played by some about the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Certainly Democrats and the liberal corporate press blame the problems in the alliance on what they considered to be Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's tilt toward Republicans and the GOP's efforts to tout its support for Israel, thereby supposedly undermining bipartisanship. But is the problem coming from the other end of the spectrum, or, is that evaluation fair?
I think what you have to do is an objective kind of review of where both parties stand today in regard to Israel. And tell you, Jonathan, if you say in Republican circles, I stand with Israel, that's an applause line. Within Democratic circles, that is not an applause line. And unfortunately, polling substantiates the fact that, unfortunately, among the Democrat base, Israel is that the alliance is not as strong, the commitment is not as strong. And by the way, I say that with lament. Because I think it's important for Israel to have bipartisan support. And in fact, I will say that among some of the Democratic leadership, you had that. But clearly among the base of the Democrat Party, support for Israel is not an applause line. It's not something that folks say proudly. And I think, John, I'll kind of a little deeper into that. I mean, it's really a product of what you see on American campuses. With the American left, Israel is seen as the Zionist oppressors. Israel, an apartheid state, that doesn't come from the right. We have enough problems on the right and anti-Semitism. I understand that. But if you look at what's happening with in terms of the political kind of divide today, the reality is that the Republican Party is much more uniformly in support of the state of Israel. By the way, whether Netanyahu is the prime minister or somebody else is the prime minister. He was not prime minister for a period of time.
Yeah.
And yet, I still worked hand in glove, to do the things I could do to support Israel, to support its security, to support the bilateral relationship. So, unfortunately, it is a reflection of the reality that among the Democrat base, among the left, Israel is not seen as a worthy ally. Again, Democrat leadership, Steny Hoyer, he's been there, and I thank you, Steny. But across the board, you are seeing differences within the bases of the Republican Party versus the Democrat Party. And again, I say that with a sense of lament, in that I think Israel does better if Democrats and Republicans fully embraced Israel. But unfortunately, that's not the political reality.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit more into sort of how the bases of the parties are different now. But I want to stop and just seize on something that you mentioned about campuses. And do you see, a lot of times, certainly when Republicans or conservatives speak of what sort of the left derides as cultural war issues, when they speak of critical race theory and intersectionality, that's considered, off the point. But aren't a lot of our problems with, support for Israel and even anti-Semitism related to the widespread acceptance in the academy, and which is migrated, to popular culture, the media, of these sort of toxic ideas that pose Jews and Israel as oppressors and as, victimizers, and in which the world is divided between victims and oppressors, and the Jews are put as oppressors. Isn't that a big piece of where this problem starts?
Jonathan, it absolutely is a big piece, and I think you've kind of laid it out very, very clearly. Jews, Israel seen as oppressors, the Palestinians seen as being oppressed. So if you put in the category of oppressors, all of a sudden that you're bad. The sad reality is that at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise across the world, not a U.S. problem. I was in Tel Aviv not too long ago, and I said I reported back to one of my friends at Poolside. He said, everyone was speaking French, and everyone, because it's tough being a Jew in France today, because of anti-Semitism. And so it's not just a U.S. issue; it's a global issue. Anti-Semitism on the rise, and unfortunately, Israel, which by the way is a state that Arabs have rights, Arabs are citizens. Gay, lesbian rights, a kind of a rarity in the Middle East. Israel has all the kind of the Western values, all the things that we cherish in a democracy are there. And yet being cast in this category of oppressor, oppressed, and therefore, and you see that on college campuses, you see that, Israel, quote, an apartheid state. It's an outrageous, unjustifiable attack on the Jewish state, and I think we got to get back to that. That some people say, "Well, I can criticize Israel, but I'm not really criticizing Jews." The reality is that Israel, the Jewish state, and efforts like BDS, the BDS movement, Israel being the oppressor, Israel being an apartheid state. That's anti-Semitism at its core. It is clearly focused on the Jewish people, on the Jewish state. And again, without any justification.
Yes, that's very true. Now, you have been on your own political journey, which from the left to the right. I might add that the first time we met, you may not recall this, was when you were in college, I was in high school, and you were serving on the Hofstra University Student Senate with my older sister. So I remember you in a previous incarnation.
My hair was a lot longer in those days.
Yes, it was. I do remember that.
I had my fists clenched quite often. I'll jump into this even before the question, but I have to say, when I switched parties, I didn't switch for value. I didn't change a position. In the end, I was fighting as a young, certainly clearly a left perspective. I graduated law school, and I first started working in the Human Rights Department for the Minnesota Attorney General in 1976, and then I wanted to try cases, so I went to the criminal division. That's where you try cases. The Attorney General's office, we would travel around the state. If a county attorney was a part-time county attorney, had maybe he was a defense lawyer part-time, and one of his clients gets charged with it, we prosecuted those cases. So I prosecuted cases throughout the state of Minnesota. If it was a complex case, a white-collar crime case of murder, we prosecuted those. And I soon learned that not everybody was a political prisoner. And that there was some very bad people that had to go to jail, and I followed it was a Churchill, probably that was Disraeli, goes back, liberal at 20, you don't have a heart, if you're conservative at 20, you don't have a heart. If you're liberal at 40, you don't have a brain. The fact is that, paid a mortgage, had a family, got married, kids, etc. But I didn't change my core values. I was still fighting the system. The difference was, and I switched when I was mayor of St. Paul, got elected as a conservative Democrat, then switched parties in 1996. Jack Kemp, famously wonderful former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, member of Congress, great professional football player. I was a Jack Kemp Republican. I cared. I'm a George Bush compassionate conservative. I say that with pride. But the forces that were fighting change when I was mayor were the unions. The forces that were fighting change was the teachers union and the public employees union. I started 20 charter schools in St. Paul. Teachers union fought it. I merged to consolidate units of government. I tried to keep it on taxes. The AFSCME and SEIU fought it. And so I didn't change values. They're still fighting a system. But today, the system are the forces of big government, big unions, others that simply didn't want to make change. And then the last comment I'll make on that is when I was running against Paul Wellstone for the United States Senate in 2002, I interviewed before the board of the editorial board of the Star Tribune, a very liberal paper still to this day, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota area. And I remember after the interview, some of the editors said to me, I was mayor then, Mayor Coleman said, you sounded like Paul Wellstone. That's the guy who's running against very far left, very, very, very liberal. And my response was, I don't take that as I take that as a compliment. I said, Paul and I want the same goals. Okay, we each want every child to have the opportunity to be the best they can be. We simply disagree on how you get there. And so from his perspective, the answer is another government program. And from my perspective, the answer is lifting up the individual. Teach somebody to fish rather than feeding them fish.
Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation of your political journey. And I didn't have to finish the question. You did it for me.
I kind of knew it was coming, by the way.
Well, it's an important story. As a Minnesotan, you are aware, of course, of when we're speaking of the Democratic base, Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis across the river from your city of St. Paul. She's one of the leaders of the Radical Congressional Squad. How did Minnesota's Democratic Farm and Labor Party, to which you once belonged, which was the party that produced pro-Israel politicians like Hubert Humphrey and Fritz Mondale, as well as the National Democratic Party, become a party where an anti-Semitic extremist like her has become not just welcome, but something of a rock star?
And by the way, to kind of add insult to injury, the largest Jewish population in Minnesota is in her district. But she did come perilously close to losing the last election to a more mainstream African-American former member of the Minneapolis School Board, guy Don Samuels. He lost by a hair in that primary, and that's unfortunate because Minnesota should do much better. I don't have a good explanation for you. I'm kind of watching this, and maybe I don't have a good explanation because my heart is broken by seeing kind of that shift to the left, the shift away from things that, by the way, again, Paul Wellstone, we could agree on the same goals, but we disagreed on how we get there. I ran against Walter Mondale ultimately after the death of Wellstone, and 10 days before the election, I ultimately ran against Mondale and was successful in winning the election. But I have the greatest respect for Walter Mondale. I disagreed with his philosophy, but I know his heart was in the right place. I know he wanted the best for all people. He was a strong supporter of Israel. But the Democratic Party has moved, and it goes back to your comments earlier. I think it's part of this kind of woke, I think, perspective. What we see now on college campuses, the progressive movement. Jews have not done really well with progressive movement. And you want to talk about Shan? You want to talk about sin? Bernie Sanders, right? He's a Landsman. Trivia question to your audience out there: name the 3 U.S. senators that served at the same time, representing 3 different states, 3 different political parties, and they all went to the same high school. And the answer is, this is a Jeopardy question: Norm Coleman, Bernie Sanders, and Chuck Schumer. Schumer being, we all went to James Madison High School. Three Jewish kids
in Brooklyn.
Difference in Brooklyn, right? By the way, Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to that same high school. But we kind of ended up in different places, and Bernie, and I think in not a good place from a Jewish perspective. And when I say Jewish, for me, part of being, and I'm not the best Jew. I'm not, the most religious Jew. I fast on Yom Kippur and I celebrate the high holy days, and we do Passover Seder's, but I can't tell you that I'm lighting candles on Shabbat every Friday night. But I am passionate about the Jewish state. I'm passionate about the Jewish state being essential to the survival of the Jewish people, both from a historical perspective, and I look to the future. And it breaks my heart that so many Jews today really don't care about the Jewish state. And people ask, why? Well, Democrats, why they overwhelmingly, why Democrats, overwhelmingly, why are Jews overwhelmingly Democrats? And the answer is because most of them really don't care about the state of Israel as a kind of a major concern. Mm-hmm. Social issues, other things come into play. But it's not the state of Israel. I heard Jews, so at this point, by the way, Republicans are making strides. I think DeSantis is looking at 45% Jewish support in Florida. Trump got something like 45% support. So we're doing well. If we do 35%, we're kind of moving up within the Jewish community. But still, Jews overwhelmingly Democrat, but in part because you don't have that. I don't think you have it. I don't think, I look at the polling, that Israel isn't the main concern. For those Jews that Orthodox Jews, those Jews that really care about Israel, they are more aligned with the Republican Party, again, for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed in this conversation.
Yeah. Well, we've touched on this. We dove right into it when we talked about what's motivating Democrats. What do you think accounts for the shift over the course of your lifetime by which the GOP became a virtual lockstep pro-Israel party, and the Democrats became the one that is deeply divided about the Jewish state? How has you mentioned before that pro-Israel is an applause line among Republicans. That wasn't necessarily true, say, 60 years ago. Republicans were, sort of split between those who were, very pro-Israel and those who were indifferent or not particularly supportive. How did the Republican Party, which, you sort of joined, as an adult, when you were already in politics, how did the Republicans change in that way?
So I'll give you, there are probably 2 perspectives. One is a real interesting one, and that is the role of evangelicals in the Republican Party. For so many of us, Jonathan, we grew up and we worried about evangelicals. They were going to try to convert us. We got to stay away from evangelicals. I remember when I was a mayor in Israel, I forget which intifada it was, but this is probably, let's say, in the mid-90s, 96, 97, when the State Department was one of the intifadas. State Department advised we don't go to Israel. So I went to Israel with maybe 2 other mayors. I know everyone else canceled out. But we were going to go, and we thought we were going to go to try to say that, listen, come to Israel. It's still important. I remember being where was it? It was just outside of Tel Aviv. And I remember being at a kind of what would have been a touristy area. The old Roman kind of amphitheater, small amphitheater. I'm just got a 60 moment here. But
probably in Caesarea?
Yeah, Caesarea. Yeah. Okay. So there, and I see a couple of tour buses. By the way, Jerusalem was empty, just empty. I see 3, and wow. And I go up and our landsmen, they're all evangelicals, okay? They were coming to Israel. Everyone else wasn't. And to me, it was kind of an epiphany that this group of Americans are so committed to Israel. Forget about it. They were coming, and they kept coming. And I've been I was there at when Netanyahu addressed the joint session of Congress, and I was with Reverend Hagi was there, and I've heard him. When at the moving of the embassy, the Republican Jewish Coalition that I chair, national chairman, we did an event with Reverend Hagi and celebrate the moving of the embassy. And so my point being is that the evangelical support for Israel has been very powerful, very strong, and very positive, very, very positive. So that I think has been part of it. And perhaps the Republican view of a strong America, a strong military, understanding the importance of the alliance with Israel as the democracy in the Middle East, celebrating the Abraham Accords. This administration, for I wouldn't even mention the word Abraham Accords. Couldn't even talk about it. Kevin McCarthy, as this podcast being shown, he's been in Israel and he spoke about the Abraham Accords. Speaker of the House McCarthy spoke about them and the importance of the Abraham Accords and the importance of Israel now reaching out, working hand in glove with our Gulf allies, understanding that the enemy is Iran. It's not the South Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's not the Emirates. It's not Egypt. It's not Israel. The enemy of democracy, the enemy of security, the enemy of peace is the mullahs and the radical Islamists in Iran who threaten to destroy Israel. The little Satan and threaten to destroy the big Satan, and that's us. And so, long answer to short question, I think you have a combination of Republicans, supporting a strong America, supporting our Democrat ally, supporting, President Trump, give him great credit for the Abraham Accords, supporting, strengthening the coalitions in the Middle East to deal with the Iranians, who are the largest state sponsors of terrorism. Whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's the radical Shias in Iraq, and of course just the mullahs in Iran. That's the enemy of security. And so Republicans recognize this, and unfortunately my Democrat friends want to bend over backwards to do a deal with them. They did that with the JCPOA, the nuclear pact, which kind of gave the Iranians a path to a nuclear weapon, gave them billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to further and to do the things the mischievous acts in the region. And so, a real divide between Republicans and Democrats, and in the end, what you get is Republicans standing strongly with Israel, being an applause line, and again, because I think values are lined up, and unfortunately, my friends on the left have moved in another direction.
Yeah. One of the issues roiling the relationship between the United States and Israel right now is the Netanyahu government's effort to pass judicial reform in Israel, with not only liberal American Jews siding with the opposition to Netanyahu, but also the Biden administration echoing, quite frankly, its own partisan appeals from the 2022 midterms about Republicans opposing democracy by now adopting the same narrative to describe Israelis who want to establish checks and balances on the power of their Supreme Court. How do you feel about Americans and their government weighing in on Israeli domestic disputes in this way?
So I think it's a mistake, and I think we need to be very careful about Americans kind of dictating to a sovereign nation. This is the policies that you need to follow in order to kind of gain our support. And this is not a human rights issue. It's not suppressing anybody's rights. Whether you can agree or disagree with the approach being taken to try to find some checks and balances with judiciary, I've heard it debated on both sides. But I really think it's a mistake for us to kind of insert ourselves in those domestic politics. And I say that, by the way, not now because Netanyahu's the prime minister, and I'll state up front, I've been a strong supporter of Bibi. By the way, you unless you read his book, you would know that his family hails from Minnesota.
Right. Yeah.
That Abraham Marcus, his great grandfather, was a fur trader in Minneapolis, 1880s, and his grandfather,
his mother's
Benny
family,
Siegel, was a scrap iron dealer in Minneapolis. When I told the prime minister when I saw him, I said, by the way, Mr. Prime Minister, all the scrap iron dealers in Minneapolis, they're still Jews. So whatever your grandfather was doing in 1915, 1910, 1890, they're still doing it today. But my point being is that again, when Bibi's not the prime minister, I'm still supporting Israel, and they will make mistakes, and they may not be perfect. But I think just as I wouldn't want Israelis kind of people say don't interfere in American politics. Right? Netanyahu got attacked for speaking before the Congress, and one could agree or disagree with that. But they were being attacked because Israelis, they were saying, shouldn't insert themselves in American politics. Well, he was not inserting himself in American politics. He was articulating a position on the threat of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which for Israelis, that is an existential threat. And so it was about Israel policy Israel's existence he was talking about. But I think there is a message there that we need to be very, very careful about inserting ourselves in the domestic policies of another country. Let them have that robust debate. The good thing about Israel, Jonathan, is that they have the debate. The good thing about Israel is that it is a democracy. It's a little different than our democracy. I don't know how they do it with multi-parties and how they make it work, but it is. As I said early on, Arabs have the right to vote, Israeli Arabs, and discrimination, non-discrimination laws, strong in Israel, protection of those rights. So I think it's a mistake for American businesses, which have done that now, a number of businesses, certainly even within the Jewish community. The Republican Jewish coalition has we did not step forward in that debate. We thought it was not appropriate for us to be kind of dictating to Israel internal domestic policy on a matter such as judicial reform.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the RJC positions of neutrality is very principled. But stepping aside from that, and not to take a position one way or the other on how Israel's judiciary and the legislature should be balanced, do you find it at all ironic, as someone who is a lawyer and who follows politics in both countries, that so many Americans, including Democrats, including Jewish Democrats in the House and the Senate, who want to pack the U.S. Supreme Court because they don't like its decisions and want to curb its rather limited power, opposing any move in Israel to limit the reach of an Israeli court, which is power that no American judge could dream of having, without any possibility of being checked by the Knesset, and can also effectively veto the naming of their successors who might disagree with their decisions. There's kind of a disconnect there, isn't it?
Yeah, and there is a disconnect. And again, we can get into the substance a little bit about this, but a Supreme Court that basically, an Israel judiciary that basically picks itself. Okay, we'll choose, and we have a veto over who gets in, who gets out. And so yeah, there's a little irony about this, but I do think it is. Let the Israelis sort that out. And again, if Israel wasn't a democracy, maybe I'd have a different perspective on that. Maybe I'd say the people don't have a right to choose, but the people have a right to choose. Governments come and go in Israel a lot more frequently than they do here in this country. They're not waiting every 4 years. Okay, sometimes it happens sooner. Sometimes they have multiple elections in 1 year. Right? And so because of that, that's where I think we have to step back and kind of let democracy take its play itself out. I do think, listen, clearly Bibi has to understand, and the government has to understand that there is great pressure, that there is great concern, and I think it's okay for folks to understand that. But then, in the end, let them make their decisions, and again, I think there is a kind of an irony, almost a disingenuousness about. And let me just say this: when I say disingenuous, I think so that's the issue today. Jonathan, we could be having a conversation in 6 months, and the Netanyahu government's still there, you're going to have another issue. Because a lot of this is not just about judicial reform, if we want to be real candid. A lot of this is an opportunity for the opposition to simply say, hey, we've got them on the run on this. We've got folks engaged across in the U.S. We've got business, industry, the Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. I think, Jonathan, they'll find another issue in a few more months. And it is, again, maybe the nature of Israeli politics, because, you don't have to wait 4 years for an election. You can put pressure on. And so I think the Netanyahu government is going to face a lot of pressure due to the nature of a very, what's the word? I don't want to say unstable coalition, but a very delicate coalition. And as such, they're going to be subject to a lot of pressure trying to move a few people to kind of make the house of cards fall down.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think the debate in Israel is really about, one side having lost an election just a few months ago, not wanting to, stick with that and hoping that they can topple the government that was just elected. And who knows, maybe they'll be able to, but that's not really about democracy. That's about politics.
It's about politics.
Yeah, but that kind of leads me into my next question. I think we could all agree, and this is in terms of American Jews and their opinions about Israel. We can all agree that everyone ought to be entitled to express opinions about events in Israel and their government policies. Is there a line that ought not to be crossed when it comes to seeking to aid efforts to pressure Israel to do things that its electorate doesn't want to do? Are there some things, not a question of shutting people up, but are there some things that American Jews really shouldn't do that you think just go completely over the line?
I have to give that's a very good question. I'm trying to think. Do you have an example, for instance, of one that you think would be?
Well, I could answer it myself.
I'd be interested in your perspective. Then, what do you?
My answer would be is everybody's got a right to express an opinion. We all know that there are a million groups among American Jews support American Friends of fill in the blank cause in Israel, from tennis to political causes. But the question is, do you use the leverage that American Jews, either politically, financially, within America, to aid efforts to pressure Israel by the American government, whether it's a Republican government or a Democratic government, to sort of undermine the will of the Israeli electorate? One of the things we hear a lot, whenever one side in Israel is losing, they look to America to help them, win battles that they can't win at home. And that's certainly one of the themes that we're hearing from the judicial reform debate. But the question is, at what point are we actually overriding Israeli democracy, not supporting it? By doing that, we're really overriding Israeli sovereignty. That would be my line.
And I gave you kind of my general principle, where I just don't think it's wise for us to be kind of inserting. When I say us, it's the Jewish communities, Jewish groups, but that also means we do it and we put pressure on folks within our representatives to use the power that they have, and that's significant power. It's listen, the left would love to get the Biden administration to put Israel in a bind on a range of issues.
Restricting aid being one,
absolutely.
being one pressure.
And so, on the other hand, I'm a big believer in democracy, and so we'll fight the battle out here. We'll fight the battle that would be good. We need to get rid of the Ilhan Omers and the Rashida Tlaibs, and we're not going to happen. But the Bernie Sanders, I don't think they're good for Israel's security. They're good for American security. But the people, they speak, and they speak in Vermont, and they spoke in the 5th District and in Minneapolis, and I'm reminded of what Ed Koch, former mayor of New York, once said, I believe after losing an election. He said, "The people have spoken; they deserve to be punished." So,
reminds me of H.L. Mencken's famous definition of democracy. It's the theory that the people deserve to get what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard.
Yeah, a variation of that. So, I don't. I like to be engaged in a debate on support of Israel with my friends on the left, and when I say I like it, if it forces among Democrats a division, that in the end, some of the old leadership has to stand up to the progressive left, and unfortunately, the progressive left is now the dominating force. We saw that with the Joe Biden, who ran as Scranton Joe, and then moved to the left on the Green New Deal, cutting off American energy production, the whole transgender, LBGQ plus whatever, kind of they're kind of just divided, even on race. They have just kind of racial division again and again, and so in the end, I don't think those policies are good for America. But as for the having a vigorous debate and me being proud that my party is a party that stands with supporting Israel, that stands with making sure that Israel's security is protected, and that America understands that ally in the Mideast is critical both to not just Israel's security but to our security. I don't mind having that debate. And in the end, does that mean that if our folks are in charge, we're going to be able to do more with Israel in terms of security? Yeah, that's the reality. And if the progressive left takes over, then Israel's position in terms of aid will be challenged. That's a political reality. And so in this country, we have to make decisions. And those should be some of the issues that we think about. And as Jews, those should be some of the things that we think about. Beyond some of the social issues, beyond some of the things that really may not impact our security as much as standing with Israel does.
Now, I know you were recently on a trip to Saudi Arabia. What can you tell us about the Saudis and their attitude towards the Biden administration and the way it may feel it's been abandoned by the U.S. and in consequence is now apparently moving to mend fences to some extent with its enemy, Iran? And what do you think this means for the hopes that were quite bright only a couple of years ago for expanding the circle of peace and getting the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords and formally recognize Israel?
So I have to, in full disclosure, though, that I work with the Saudis in Washington. I work with the embassy, and I do that proudly. No question that that bilateral relationship is important. By the way, it's important to Israel, in that again the enemy in the region is Iran. That's the enemy that threatens to destroy Israel. And by the way, it's the enemy that threatens the kingdom. It's the Iranians are supporting the Houthis as a proxy, and then the Houthis are raining rockets, on Saudi and on the UAE. The forces of terrorism in the region, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, that's a challenge to all in the region. And so I think the problem actually it goes back to the Biden administration. And if you recall, when the Biden administration did the Iran deal, they did it without telling the Israelis that they were negotiating with the Iranians. They did it without telling the Saudis that they were negotiating with the Iranians. In fact, I think Obama was quoted saying basically the Saudis have to learn to share the region with the Iranians. That's like telling a group of neighbors on a block that you got to share the neighborhood with a pedophile who just moved in, 2 doors away. And so what you have is a situation where clearly at that time I think it created somewhat a divide. I have to believe, and this is just kind of my kind of objective view of kind of what's going on in the world. That action of the U.S. kind of negotiating with the Iranians, accelerating their opportunity for a nuclear weapon, having no restraints on their doing the nefarious deeds that they do in the region with supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Al Jazeera. I have to think that probably brought the Saudis and the Israelis a little closer. I think it's been said, I think it's fair to say that Bahrain would not be part of the Abraham Accords if the Saudis didn't kind of say, go ahead and do that. They're the 800-pound gorilla on the block in the Mideast. And so I think what you had is an Obama administration that clearly, said to our friends, our Gulf allies, the Obama administration catered to the Muslim Brotherhood. Believing that was the path of the Arab future. Bad bet, bad folks to bet on because they weren't good guys. Again, tying into the Iranian influence, the radical influence. And so I think what you have is now a Mideast in which you have an Abraham Accords, in which you have the Saudis saying, clearly that it's not if, but when with Israel in terms of normalization. You have Senator Graham, who just came back from the kingdom, who talked about normalization and talked about if the U.S. would do several things with the Saudis, that normalization becomes more of a reality. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I will say this: the Biden administration has been, how do I say this? Not as bad as the Obama administration, for whatever reason, but still of concern. The Houthis, rained rockets on the UAE in January. I think it was January 17th. Huge rocket attack. The UAE will talk about that being the 9/11, not an impact, but if they had not stopped the missiles, what it would have been. And I don't think the U.S. said or did anything in response. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you're seeing is a little kind of questioning. Are you going to be there? And so the Saudis all of a sudden have a conversation with the Iranians. It may be that they're hoping the Iranians won't be supporting the Houthis, and if they're not supporting the Houthis, they won't have to then worry about rocket attacks on their civilian areas and on their oil production. And by the way, we have a lot of U.S. citizens and troops in those areas, and so it's not the kind of rock solid, we're all in this together relationship that I think you'd want to have. When I say all, being those folks who support Israel, support understand the importance of ensuring that the Iranians, that they don't take control. They operate now in 5 capitals. They operate Sana'a, they control in Yemen, Baghdad, a major influence in Baghdad, in Syria, a major influence. Obviously, in Tehran is their capital, and who did I miss? There's in Lebanon, mm-hmm. right? So if
wholly own concern there, yeah,
right, yeah, and so again, with all those, if you kind of look at who are our friends and who are our enemies, the enemy is clearly Iran. And our friends are the Gulf states that are trying to stand in opposition to that, and what we're seeing is more and more a warming and extending the relationship with the Jewish state.
Yeah, that's a good summation. I'd like to shift for a moment to a discussion of the issue that I think concerns all Jews, which is the growth in anti-Semitism. And do you think our mainstream organizations representing Jewish interests, or supposedly representing Jewish interests, are sufficiently concerned about the way the left has become sort of the home for anti-Zionist activity like BDS, as well as ideologies, as we spoke before, like critical race theory, that more or less grant a permission slip for Jew hatred? Or are they all still stuck in the mindset of trying to blame it all on the far right and, of course, linking it to Donald Trump?
Sadly, it is a problem that is both a problem on the left and certainly on the far right. I took President Trump to task, for dining with a noted anti-Semite at Mar-a-Lago. Took him to task for that. Bad judgment. But on the other hand, I think the way you phrase the question, our friends in the left simply ignore the reality of what's happening in the left. What's happening in college campuses, what's happening among progressives, the growing squad in Washington. Those voices are the loudest voices on the left, and you're right. They view Jews now as the oppressor. It's an absurd proposition, and as such, I like this. My son, when he was in college, came home one day and his professor was talking about Israel, the apartheid state. I think he was worried about failing the course because he had a blowout argument with his professor. But that's the view on college campuses. On college campuses, it takes courage to wear a kippah, to wear a yarmulke today. And to me, that's outrageous to stand up, have Jewish speakers speak up for Jewish causes. You're seeing the left all of a sudden, ignoring the concepts of free speech. which is a shame, by the way, that college campuses, which should be bastions of kind of discovery and debate, or views that aren't consistent with the progressive left are quickly shouted down. And so we can't ignore the problem on the right. We can't ignore the problem of neo-Nazis, but that's not the pervade. That problem is a small sprinkling of lunatics and crazy folks versus a swath of the American public, college campuses, young people who are being fed this pablum of Jews, Israel, being somehow an apartheid state, and I think our friends on the left give short. They don't deal with it. They don't take it head on. So I think that's a great shame. I've become Bill Maher. I've been kind of an admirer lately of some of the things that he's taking on the woke left and taking on some of this craziness, and I very rarely agree with him on anything. But I think the left needs to kind of hold the mirror up and look in the eye, and see where this wokeism is going. And what it means, for to Jews who again, we all grew up in the civil rights. We say civil rights, Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney, right? 2 Jews in African America, murdered down south. Civil rights was part of our heritage. It still is. It still is. And yet we're seeing divides now, and I think that it ties into kind of where the quote progressive left is, where they're at on Israel. And in the end, things like BDS are, I think, one of the largest purveyors of anti-Semitism that we have in this country.
Yeah. Now, the RJC obviously wants to stay neutral in the 2024 GOP presidential primaries, but with the former president, seemingly having a huge lead, President Biden pretty much being, having assured of the Democratic nomination. How worried are you about the prospect of a rerun of 2020 without any change at all on either side?
So I'm smiling, and for those who are listening and not seeing, because I still don't think Biden's going to be the candidate. I don't think that it's, and he's got an assured path to the nomination. But are young people going to be voting for, somebody who is, questioned? Will they fill out their term? And again, it's not just age. I think it's, let's kind of say it up front. It's all too often, Biden is does he know where he's at? Does he know what he's saying?
Without a cheat sheet showing what the questions that he's about to be asked.
Telling what the question is, right? Who to call and the names of here's your secretary, here's his name, and I truly still believe that at a certain point in time, and again, by the way, and popularity levels at 39%. So on the Democrat side, I don't think that's a done deal. And I think in about 6 months, when it's clear young people are not going to be voting for this guy. He's not getting stronger, and it's not about age. There are 80 years old and 90-year-olds that are as robust as can be. I was in the office of Hank Greenberg not too long ago, 90-something years old, and he was just coming back from China. He's a guy that was head of AIG, noted American, CEO, 90-something years old, as sharp as can be. I mean, Kissinger still has his wits about him. He's 100. I don't know.
Yeah, he's pushing.
But it's not about age. But Biden is simply. I'm just going to say it. He's not all there, and he's not at the top of his game. And so let's kind of put that out there. With Trump, again, it's a long time away between now and November. So I applauded Donald Trump as being the best friend that Israel's ever had in the White House. Whether it's moving the embassy, recognizing the Golan Heights, and having Nikki Haley, by the way, as ambassador to the UN and fighting the rampant anti-Semitism in the UN, unleashing her. The team that he assembled around him, the Mike Pompeos. I'm sad that he's not still running for president. I think a great public servant. I think we're a long way from determining, though, who's going to be the candidate. Clearly, Donald Trump is the most popular person in the Republican Party today. The other reality is among suburban women, college-educated males, we don't do well with the president, and so can he change that between now and next November, or are we going to be stuck at 40-something% and in the end, have a Democrat take the presidency? I don't know. But again, he is clearly the strongest voice in the Republican Party. It's almost, has the strongest level of support. But we're a long way between now and November. So let's kind of see how all this plays out. Again, I'm not one who believes that Joe Biden is going to be the Democrat nominee, and I can't tell you who it's going to be. Part of Biden's problem is that if he runs with this ticket, you got Kamala Harris, who would go into the presidency. I think Americans are going to say no, no to that. So in politics, a week is a long time. Between now and November 24 is an eternity. So kind of let's see how things play out. The president has welcomed Nikki Haley into the fold. We'll see what Vice President Mike Pence, who's been a great friend of Israel and I think was a superb vice president, he's still out there, and perhaps a number of others. Tim Scott, great American, senator from South Carolina, African American, gave a magnificent response to the State of the Union, a while ago, and so I think the game is yet to be played. A lot of water yet to kind of flow under that bridge. So we'll see what happens in 2024. But Republicans have a lot of good choices. And in the end, when people look at this administration, the Biden administration, and the disaster that it's done to the economy, the disaster that it's done with inflation, the disaster at the border, the disaster to Americans' respect in the world, I think they're going to be looking for change, and certainly my party is going to be able to offer it.
Yeah, well, that's true. It is an eternity until November 2024. I'll just say, I don't see, I'll have to disagree with you. I don't see the mechanism on the Democratic side to stop Joe Biden. I've known him a long time. You knew him, you served with him in the Senate. He spent his whole life trying to be president. He'll be dragged out of the White House kicking and screaming. I don't believe
that hearing that
yeah, right, exactly.
It's like an aphrodisiac, right?
Exactly. I don't see how he is stopped, and they've set it up. So they're not going to have any debates. I think it's kind of fixed.
Let's get back. Make sure we get back together before November 2024.
Okay, well, that would be good. I would. Well, I'm sure. I'll hold you to that.
Okay.
On the other hand, I think one of the dynamics on the Republican side is that the Democrats are doing everything they can to nominate Donald Trump. All these indictments, that's just serving to unite Republicans behind him. It's making him more popular. The more he's attacked by Democrats, the more Republicans rally around him, regardless of the popularity of any of the other candidates or the qualifications of the other candidates. And I might add Ron DeSantis, whom you didn't mention in your list, who's right now sort of still way behind Trump, but far ahead of the other challengers. As long as the Banana Republic prosecutions of Trump go on, that may just end the Republican game there too.
I don't argue with anything that you just said. I think the effort to try to get this president, to get Donald Trump at all cost, at any cost, is only uniting Republicans to say enough. So that clearly plays out in his favor. But again, long time between now and November.
For decades, Jewish Republicans have been seeking to chip away at the Democrats' large advantage in the Jewish vote. And while there has been some change, especially in certain communities and states, on the whole, the numbers still show that at least 2/3 of Jews are voting for Democrats, especially in presidential elections, although as you noted, in certain states, certain elections, Republicans are doing better. And the GOP stance on Israel is kind of not enough to outweigh the Jews' generally liberal stance on domestic issues, especially on abortion, which is a big deal with a lot of Jews. We can debate that, whether that should be considered a Jewish issue. Are you confident this equation can be altered in your lifetime, or is it going to require a fundamental shift in the Jewish vote. Will that have to await demographic changes related to assimilation, in which Orthodox Jews who tend to be more Republican will gradually assume a greater share of the Jewish vote?
So I let me be more optimistic in that I don't think this is, and clearly has not been a kind of a static. Democrats, our Jewish voters are Democrats, and only a small percentage are Republicans. We keep growing, and I should have the numbers in front of me. But if you go back from where we were, first of all, one of the big divides was I think when Barry Goldwater didn't vote for the Civil Rights Act, I think that was kind of a moment in time, and it pushed a lot of Jews, to say we're just going to vote Democrat. And so I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I never met a Republican until I went to college. There were none in my family, and there were none in my neighborhood. Rudy Giuliani lived in a different neighborhood. He said he was a Republican when he was younger. There weren't many.
Actually, he was a Democrat when he was younger too. He switched as an adult too. Don't let him get away with that.
Good, thank you for telling me that, because I know he's another Brooklyn boy. But we're seeing a steady progression, Jonathan, and so we've moved from 21% to 23% to 25% to 30% now being Republicans. And moving up, and ultimately you get to DeSantis in Florida and 45%, and Trump, I think, in Florida. New York Times had him maybe at 40%, could be a little more than that. And so what you're seeing is a steady rise. Clearly, we have to deal with the social issues. What was it? I forget who I'm taking somebody's line, but with the Chomsky, something when Moses came down from the mountain. Too many of our landsmen thought he had the two tablets, right? And two and a half thought on one of them was written abortion and the other gay rights, and those are the only issues, And so we've actually, gay rights is probably not a big issue. I think folks have kind of accepted equality there. They're getting a little concerned about how far folks are going with that and what's happening with transgender. But okay, we'll put that aside. Abortion's still a big issue and still a concern, but not the only issues. And I think that, and Israel is certainly an issue for a lot of Jews, but again, not enough. Not there are many who simply that's not rated as the top issue. But if you look at, we're an entrepreneurial group, okay? Democrat positions are big government, big taxes. Republican positions, more, supporting the entrepreneurial class, supporting economic independent, economic growth, opportunity, etc. School choice, big issue among many Jews, not just the Orthodox, but across the board. Republicans typically supporting school choice, Democrats opposing it. And so what you're doing is you're seeing kind of a progression, a combination of economic policy, combination of some kinds of social policies, such as school choice, that is a social policy. And so I think what you're seeing, I know you are seeing a steady rise in Republican support within the Jewish community. Not a majority, and in my lifetime, maybe it's not going to be a majority, but probably not. But it's not at 21% to 23. Now we're at 33, 35. We can get to 40 among some candidates, like a DeSantis and like a Trump in Florida, even higher. And so I'm more optimistic, and I'm optimistic because in the end, when I was running for office, and I tell people, I say to people, I say, when you wake up in the morning, and you're sitting around the breakfast table, okay, what are you talking about? Okay, you're talking about one is mom and dad going to work. Okay, look at what this Democrats doing with the economy, killing it. Republicans much better. You want to make sure your kid is go to a good school. Okay, Republicans supporting school choice, Democrats being the party of during the COVID keeping kids schools shut. You're worried about your public safety. Democrats being the party of defunding the police, and Republicans being the party of stronger police and stronger public safety. So if you look at the issues that sitting around a breakfast table with mom and dad chatting, families, supporting strong families, versus Democrat, kind of a different perspective. If you look at those choices, I think we stand to gain. If you look at the things that are important to Jews, which are really important to Americans, economic opportunity, quality education, public safety, and then, by the way, America's place in the world, being proud of America. Republicans are proud of this country. proud of what we did in World War II, proud of where America has stood, proud of American innovation. And all too often my Democrat friends are down on America, thinking that America is somehow an oppressive force in the world. I don't believe that. I still say we are still the shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan talked about. And so in the end, Jonathan, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we're moving in the right direction for the right reasons. I think the Democrats are on the wrong side of those issues that should be important to Jewish Americans, indeed all Americans. And so, we'll see how this plays out. But unfortunately, we have a long way to go. We've got a lot to make up because we were in a narrow place at one point in time, going back to, the mid-'60s. And I think we're making progress.
Well, I think you've laid that out very clearly. Senator Coleman, thanks so much for joining us today and for giving us some important insights on all these issues. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or on Twitter or on the JNS YouTube channel or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.